public health and communication, the masking requirement, what that means and how long that'll be in place, those kinds of things, transportation, some other various aspects, and then open it up for questions. So that's kind of the general approach. And what I would say is if you jump on the, I'm not sure if I am going to see the comment boxes, but as those come up, I think between Krista and Angel, pardon me, and I will get all of your questions answered, and I want to provide an opportunity for folks to ask questions if they have any as well. If you are a parent, I'm going to start with of kids in Rapids Public Schools, that is. I'll start with a preemptive apology indicating you probably read more information and documentation coming out of my office in our schools than you ever have in your life. That's a positive thing in some respects, but I also understand that that's a lot of info. You know, there's been a lot of details shared, and frankly, you don't really know what it's going to be like till school starts and kids are in buildings and you get an understanding of how things are going to go. But with that said, so in a general sense, we start tomorrow. That is our official first day of school. Our elementary buildings, as well as River Cities High School, are going to be 5-day per week in-person instruction with safety precautions in place. And so that includes all of our elementaries and, as I mentioned, River Cities High School. The safety precautions that we're talking about is really the idea of doing our best to ensure that cohort groups are as small as possible. And the cohort that we're talking about with regard to our elementary buildings would probably be that class. And I say probably because in a kindergarten class, it's probably the whole class. In a 4th or 5th grade class, it may not be. So some of those safety precautions we're talking about are the same things you've been hearing about over and over again in the community and you know, reading about in the news, which has to do with ensuring that we do our best job possible to maintain physical distancing. But we also know that, you know, these are kids and kids in a classroom environment. So very clearly the expectation isn't that each kid is inside a protective bubble and they don't come into contact with any other kids or staff throughout the day, but it is figuring out ways to minimize or mitigate that. So I'll give you an example of, let's say, a kindergarten classroom, and then an example of maybe a 4th or 5th grade classroom, and then what I think things are going to look like in between. And then we'll move on to what our secondary building plans happen to be. So in a general sense, in looking at our numbers, we already have fairly low elementary class sizes where most of them are 20 kids or less. Sometimes they're 21 or 22, but in most cases it's 20 or less. And because we've offered this virtual or off-site option, those numbers are even lower, of course, as we head into this year. I should also mention that all parents had an opportunity to elect to not send their kid to school in person in any capacity and have the opportunity to go virtual or off-site. And therefore, our numbers, many parents and kids took advantage of that. And I'd say it's just over 10% of the district population, so just over 500 students, right around 510, 508, something like that, have chose the 100% off-site option. And so those students, of course, wouldn't be reporting to buildings in any capacity. However, they were going to be receiving instruction from either district staff or what's called a local education guide, a LEG, L-E-G, as kind of a contact, a parent contact to work through plans off-site. But here in the building, what we'll have is students arriving to school. In kindergarten classroom, as I mentioned, what it would be is the cohort group is basically the kids in that room. And so we're going to do some things that we may not have done, that not have been done in the past, such as each kid gets their own materials. A lot of the time in the elementary school, you throw all your stuff together and kids come and grab crayons when they need them or markers or that kind of thing. Each kid will have their own materials, so you limit, you know, kids touching and using things and then other kids touching and using those same things. Doing our best to keep kids, you know, somewhat distanced from one another, but once again, it's a kindergarten room, so a bunch of 5 or 6-year-olds running around. It's not going to be this militant sort of approach, but the idea is limiting then the potential contact of those students between other kindergarten students or other classes. So then it becomes how we operate with inside the building, meaning in some cases you might bring a couple kindergarten classes together to do a group activity, or you might have 4th grade readers come in to spend time with kindergartners, for example. Those things we're not going to be doing. We'll be isolating it to individual classrooms. Then of course, wearing masks or face coverings is an expectation both of the governor's order as well as by board action as part of our reopening plan. And I do want to clarify that that expectation is when you're in the building, because as the governor's order indicates, the only time inside, when you're inside, that you don't need to wear a mask is when you're alone. So as an example, I'm in my office right now, doors closed, I'm the only person in here, I'm not required to wear a mask. It'd be similar for students. So if students are alone, which doesn't happen too often, they wouldn't have to wear a mask, or when they're eating or drinking. And then when they go outside for recess, or a teacher takes them outside for class, they are not going to be required to wear a mask. So there's opportunities that teachers can build into the day to give kids a break from wearing a mask. And I'd also say that our staff recognize too that we're working with kids, and kids make mistakes. And so there won't be anything, any disciplinary consequences for a kid choosing not to wear a mask or forgetting to wear a mask. It'll just simply be friendly reminders, as there are with everything else that we engage in with elementary kids. But in general, think about that class, being kind of their cohort. And when you get up into, say, a 4th or 5th grade classroom, you have an opportunity to enhance that physical distancing to a degree a little bit more easily than you would with lower elementary students. So think about having consistent seating charts, right? So if Craig comes to class, he's going to sit in this desk, and next to Craig, we're going to do our best to keep kids 6 feet apart. But next to Craig is going to be a kid or two, and those are probably kids that I'm going to work with in a partner work or in small group work. And that means if Craig's a positive COVID case, that the kids that are in most immediate contact with him, those 2 or 3 kids, are also going to have to quarantine rather than the entire class. And so that's really what the goal and the rub is. So all of the things that we've implemented are precautions and approaches to hopefully reduce the number of people that are considered close contacts. And I'll get more into that, those specifics in just a second. So really it's about modifying schedules to a degree and modifying behavior. In most of our elementary buildings, kids are going to go to the cafeteria and eat in the cafeteria. Instead of having 1, 2, or 3 or 4 grades in there all at once, it'll probably just be 1 grade level, and each class will have their own spot at a table. So we increase the number of lunch periods that we have, and we make modifications around procedures in that regard. Thinking about secondary buildings, what we have is implemented as the AB cohort schedule, and the whole approach to that was to decrease the number of kids in the building at any one given time. And some of this was shared with parents with regard to these reopening communications, but the piece I think that's the most transient or salient is the idea that if we had, well, there's 1,500 students at Lincoln High School, and there's about 1,100 at Rams when they're at their normal operating capacity. And at the secondary level, you probably recall teachers don't stay in one class, or pardon me, students don't stay in one classroom, the teachers do. And the reason behind that is that because of licensure, there's licensure requirements, and because of the nature of secondary school schedules, it's really not plausible or possible to have all of the freshmen, for example, sit in the classrooms that they're supposed to be in and just have freshman teachers rotate into those classrooms. The reason being is that first period I might have all freshmen, but second period I'm going to have some 10th graders, 11th graders, and some 12th graders, and whatever my second period class would happen to be. And the same thing happens at Rams. So the thought process was, okay, we have to figure out ways to decrease the number of students in that building at any one given time, because the contacts, the close contacts that we're talking about, I should clarify, are individuals that you've been in closer than 6 feet of distance from for greater than 15 minutes. Because one of the pieces that was also a misunderstanding is what's considered a close contact, and how come I can go to Walmart and Home Depot and so forth and do all these things in a day, and if I had COVID-19, all of those people don't have to quarantine. And that's because of this close contact piece. And same thing there. When kids are in classes, there'll be half the number of students that would normally be there, approximately. Our class sizes in the secondary buildings range anywhere from, some small classes have 12 kids or 13, and then some larger classes have up to 30. So now you're talking about having, as low as 6 kids in a class and as high as 15. That gives you an opportunity to space those kids out when they're in that classroom. In our secondary buildings, based on some student behavior change and some staff behavior changes, it should be pretty difficult to identify, well, it should be difficult to say, I know for a fact this kid's a close contact because of my classroom. Because again, we have those 6 foot minimum distancing measures in place, as well as masks and frequent hand washing and these other pieces. But keep in mind that close contact criteria. So for example, Craig's in his biology class first period. I'm in there with, let's say, 12 or 13 other students. We're spaced out. We have 6 feet of distance. We're wearing our masks. The teacher, for the most part, stays within, away 6 feet or greater from students. we're basically able to conduct our business, but keep ourselves, for the most part, distance. And when the question's asked, if Craig was a positive COVID case, do you have any close contacts? In some cases in the classroom, because of partner work or lab work, we might have to answer yes, or because a staff member was working with a kid. But in many cases, we're going to be able to answer no. And a lot of the times, those close contacts are going to be kids and other community members that have those contacts not as a result of school, but as a result of things they're doing outside of school. So think about your kid and their friends. And I have 3 kids that are all going to be at Lincoln High School next year, and know full well that if they have exposure, it likely won't be because of the school environment, but it'll be because of what they're doing outside of school, or other activities and things that we're engaged in. So that's really what the name of the game is. In that cohort schedule, those kids are going to attend 2 days. So 2 of my kids, my freshman boys, twins, are part of the A cohort. They're going to start tomorrow, and they come in person Tuesday and Wednesday. Now, normally it's going to be Monday, Tuesday, and the reason it's Tuesday, Wednesday this week and next is because we don't have school, and next Monday we don't have school due to the holiday. So they're going to attend Tuesday and Wednesday the next 2 weeks. And then when they're home Thursday and Friday, they're going to have things to work on via Canvas, which is the virtual platform that's used for communicating all the classroom information, assignments, activities, and all of those things that are required. There can be video links, there can be any number of things. So then when they're not on site, they're going to be working on the things that they've kind of discussed and have been laid out on the 2 days that they were in session. And for cohort B, which my daughter's part of cohort B, they're going to then start Thursday, Friday. And so they officially start Thursday of this week, and then they'll have things that they're doing Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday of next, while cohort A is back in, well, pardon me, not Monday because that's a holiday, sorry, but Tuesday, Wednesday of next week when cohort A is back in session. So in a general sense, that's really what we're considering a hybrid. You might have heard that tossed around. A hybrid meaning a part virtual and a part in person. Once again, the name of the game is looking at methods to address potential close contacts and reduce that sort of capability. That is kind of a synopsis of the reopening. The way a business will be conducted in our classrooms at our various levels. And I want to launch into what I'm talking about more, expand more about close contacts and quarantines and what this means, long-term or short-term within the buildings and what the likelihood of various scenarios happens to be. But I'm wondering if there's any questions specifically about anything that I've discussed here on the front end, just around the general operation of or plan of what it's going to kind of look like for elementary and secondary kids when they come.
Angel, did you have anything that popped up so far?
I have not. Again, as a reminder, if you would like to ask a question, please use the chat feature. That way we don't have a bunch of people trying to talk at once. Feel free, we'll take just a second. If you have a question, please type it in there and then I can read that off to Craig.
Craig, I do have a question for you. I know I've seen it out on the media, social media and stuff, and I had a couple people ask me, like you said, your daughter's on a different days than your kids, your boys are. Is there a reason for that they're not all the kids are on the same days? I don't know. I mean, if it's grade wise or how you're doing that.
No, in fact, their choice. So it'd probably been easier for us as parents if they were all 3 of them on the same schedule. But that's what they wanted to choose, and the delineation really was artificial. So initially, what Lincoln did, Rams was a little bit more straightforward. So let's take that first because it's easier. So Rams already naturally has an A group and a B group. And the reason being is because they do teaming, right? And so when we're in normal operation, for anybody that had a kid at Rams, you know that your kid was assigned to the A group or B group. And that basically means they get a certain set of teachers and they circulate amongst that specific set of teachers. And that's for scheduling purposes and for things that happen kind of internally. So with regard to this, what Rams did was they take the A group and then split the A group in half. So then you have A1 and A2. And by virtue of that, they just cut that down the middle, and they did the same thing with the B group. So now you have A1, A2, B1, B2, and those kids will be spread then amongst all those teachers. So in a normal circumstances, if I was an A group kid, I would have certain A teachers during my day. Now, if I'm A1, I might have those same A teachers, but if I'm A2, I'd have the B teachers, if that makes sense. So they
Okay.
just took the two groups and then split them, and then communicated what that split was, and then allowed for parents to say, oh, wait a second, I got a high school kid that's on the A group. Can I get on the A group? Or maybe my sixth grader's on the B and my eighth grader's on the A, and I want them both in the A. So we made those modifications.
Okay, so they can still do that. That was my question. I know that
Yeah,
there
oh,
was,
absolutely.
okay,
Absolutely. So if there's still a need to change and shift things back and forth, we can do that.
okay,
At Lincoln, it was more organic. So they just said, hey, we're doing A group and B group, select which one you like. They determined how those stacked up. And if it wasn't a decent 50-50, then they went back and kind of assigned and then made some adjustments after the fact. So it
Okay.
was kind of same thing, it conceived of in two different manners.
okay. And as of right now, it's for the whole school year, or is it, are you looking at it every trimester, or what is your plan for that?
Yeah, well, we're gonna evaluate this approach probably every 2 weeks, meaning we're not that we think we're gonna change that quick.
Okay,
Because if I were to, place a bet on what I think is gonna happen, I would argue that as we launch into the winter season here, we're probably gonna more trend towards a virtual possibility than we are, back full-time in person. Now, if they develop a vaccine and for whatever reason they can make, several 100 million vaccines fairly quickly and everybody gets vaccinated, we might be in a different ball of wax. But we're constrained by the contact tracing and the quarantine protocols that are set forth by the Department of Health Services. And I can get into that piece too.
okay, thank you.
There's a question that popped out about what happens if schools close for Rams due to snow or other unscheduled days, Rams or Lincoln. And ironically, not much. So what'll likely happen is that those kids that are supposed to be in attendance that day won't attend and they'll receive their instruction virtually. So that's the nice thing about that AB cohort model, is the approach that it can go to 100% virtual pretty easily because they're going to know what the interaction and the interface looks like because they're doing it 3 days a week. And
Right,
so really what it would be is a quick email from the teacher to say, hey, you guys aren't in school today, so feel free to check Canvas. The stuff that you need to do is up. And if we close on a Tuesday, those kids that are the A group that are attending Monday, Tuesday simply won't attend. When Thursday rolls around, we'll be back to the B group. Because one thing we've discussed is that we're not going to have all of these changes, and we're going to do our best to keep groups Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, and remain consistent with that. And that's one of the approaches of the cohort that we established that is at least somewhat, well, it's less confusing than other options that are out there. Every other week and every third day. I mean, some craziness is going on in other school districts, not meaning to disparage them. But as a parent myself, once again, keeping track of when the heck my kids are supposed to be at school or not supposed to be becomes pretty difficult. So as it stands now, it just wouldn't be a day for them. They'd learn virtually. And then whatever the next day that would come would be whatever cohort was scheduled for that day anyway. I'm not sure if that was clear, but I hope that answers the question.
so pretty much there'll never be a snow day again, right?
In this year and ironically last year there wasn't either. And it was also the first year in probably a decade where we could have had spring sports on a normal schedule and not have canceled the first week or two or even 3 of spring sports. And lo and behold, here we are, everybody's at home because we're closed by state order. So yeah, you never know what you're gonna get. But the odds of it being like a totally off day and we don't need to do anything as a result of it being a snow day, right, those days are for the most part gone.
Okay, Angel we have a question popped up, so can we have Craig answer that first?
Yeah, so it says, is there assigned times for kids to need to log in and complete their assignments? Do they need to log in every day that they are virtual, is the question.
Yeah, that's a great question. So operationally, some of that's going to be up to the classroom teacher. We're not so, and that's an excellent point to raise. So we have to think about attendance in more of instead of a physical attendance capacity, we have to think about it in terms of progress. And so some teachers might think, okay, on your off days, there's certain things I want you to get done and it needs to be submitted by this date. So clearly then a kid would have to do that and have it submitted by that date. Nonetheless, if you log on at 2 o'clock in the morning and complete it and submit it and it's due and it's in by the due date, no harm, no foul. I mean, I don't know any parent that would advocate for that, but the virtual model provides kids the flexibility and families the flexibility to kind of do it when they have the time to do it. So when they're on their off days, if they're not in person attending, there's going to be a lot of flexibility with what kids and parents can do with that time. However, there may be times where the teacher says, you know, on this day, I want this group to log in. Here's a Google Meet invite, or here's a Zoom invite. Everybody jump on. We're going to review X, Y, or Z. So that possibility exists too, and that would be identified by the individual teacher. But in a general sense, you're going to get everything you need during the in-person days, and then you're going to be working from home, excuse me, on the days that you're virtual, with a lot of flexibility around that. A nice aspect of that for some folks is a lot of our kids work. So they would absolutely be able to go to work and work for 2-3 hours and still go home and do the schoolwork that was required. So there'll still be deadlines, there'll be check-ins, but it won't be quite as regimented as 5-day-a-week in-person attendance.
Okay. Perfect. I know that Wausau went to, I think 8 to 2, they're on the computers every day, or 4 days a week. So that was a great question.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And everybody's conceiving of it in slightly different capacity. But keep in mind, if I've got kids Monday, Tuesday, and then I've got kids Thursday, Friday, I'm kind of doing the same content with both of those groups.
Right.
So a teacher could say, hey, in order to get questions answered, you can log on at 8 o'clock and join my class at 8 o'clock, and you'll get the same thing. You see what I'm saying? So
Yep.
It's possible, but that wouldn't be necessarily what everybody's doing. I think it's going to be used as an assistance, or, you know, a resource more than it is a mandatory sort of thing.
Okay, perfect. I think that was only one. So if you want to go on to your next part, that would be great.
Absolutely. So everybody is thinking about these close contacts and quarantines, and what does that mean? And how come if we get COVID at a bar in town or a business in town, it shuts down for 3 days and then it opens again? And frankly, that has to do more with optics than it has to do with the order of the public health department. Because what ends up happening is the public health department will say, hey, we have a positive COVID case. They spent time at your establishment. And based on a conversation about what they were doing there, how long they were there, whether they're an employee or not, that kind of thing, all of the things they touched or came into contact with, the business might say, well, boy, in order to do a deep cleaning, we're going to shut her down for a day or so and then reopen. That's not because the health department told them that they had to do that. That's the approach that they took, probably to ensure that their clientele and customers feel safe coming back to that environment. Because the question has been that's out there is, so if there's a positive COVID case, is that school going to get shut down? And the answer to that question is no. So in a general sense, a student, let's take a student first, a student attends school. They go home. Well, we can be notified of this in any way, a couple of different capacities. They could show symptoms here at school, in which case if they're showing symptoms, we bring them to what we're considering isolation. All that means is that they're in a separate room. There's still supervision. There's still interactions with human beings. They're not just locked in a room somewhere, but they're placed in isolation. The parents are called. Parents come and pick them up. And from there, we'll provide them, the parents, some details about what to do. So that's one way that we can identify. A parent could call a kid in and say, my kid has symptoms and they're staying home. Okay, great. That'll trigger a similar kind of activity. Or the county could contact us and say, hey, this kid or family has a positive COVID case. In all of those cases, once we think there might be a COVID case, it triggers a couple of different things. So first off, we're talking now when we know that it's a positive COVID case. We would say, okay, who are this kid's close contacts? Meaning, who do they come into contact with for longer than 15 minutes? And then again, contact is less than 6 feet for longer than 15 minutes. And we identify those students and staff members that fall into that category. Those are considered close contacts. The student's family, immediate family, if they're living in the same household, are also considered close contacts as a result of that. So if it's a positive case, any close contacts would have to quarantine for 14 days. The person with COVID symptoms has to quarantine for 10 days after the symptoms, once the symptoms develop. So in a general sense, if you have COVID, you can quarantine for fewer days than people that were just close contacts. And yes, I understand the incongruence with that statement, but that is the approach that we're constrained with. A personal story in that regard, my daughter was involved in the strength and conditioning at Lincoln High School this summer. We implemented cohorts. The kids were traveling in groups of 2 or 3 students. One of the kids in her cohort, a friend of hers, was a positive COVID case. My daughter then had to quarantine for 14 days, as well as one other student. She did not develop any symptoms or signs, and everything was fine. But nonetheless, during her quarantine for 14 days, the other kid who was positive was able to return and resume normal activity and got to do a volleyball camp that my daughter had to miss out on because she was still in quarantine. And, you know, going through why that is, it has everything to do with what their protocols have to do with public health and the approach. So if you have symptoms or if you're a positive case, you quarantine for 10 days because your infectious period was typically 2 or 3 days prior to those symptoms arising. If you're a close contact, it's 14 because anywhere in that window, you can develop symptoms. If you were to develop symptoms on day 14 of your quarantine, another 10. So you could technically be out up to 24 days as a result of quarantine and never really become super sick, which is usually the case for most kids that are school age, that it doesn't become you know, a significant issue. But nonetheless, so we identify, and then they do what's called contact tracing. So we notify the health department, and the school will kind of begin the process by talking with the parents and say, hey, you probably want to identify who the close contacts are and describe what that is. We're going to ask the classroom teacher who would the close contacts be within this classroom. And then, of course, we're going to notify relevant parents if those kids need to quarantine. And we're going to then send out a letter to that classroom as well. Hey, there was a positive COVID case in teacher X's class. Students that are required to quarantine have been contacted and are quarantining, and so forth. And then we'll, you know, continue quote unquote normal activities. With that said, as I mentioned earlier, at like a kindergarten, first grade class, when you have younger students that are, you know, prone to be a little harder to keep apart from one another, and cohorting is basically that classroom, it might be the whole class. You know, it might be that we have to respond that every kid in this class and the teacher are considered close contacts. And so therefore that whole group then, the whole classroom would quarantine for 2 weeks, including the teacher. The teacher would maintain their instruction in an off-site capacity. So they would revert to kind of a virtual format. And the information that parents and kids would need to access the class and log on and so forth would be provided. The classroom teachers are going to be going through these things with their kids when they have them in person, so that there shouldn't be anything that is a huge surprise to folks. Our elementary buildings are using a program called Seesaw. So for those of you that are familiar with like Canvas or Google Classroom, it's similar in that capacity. It's a virtual platform to communicate content to students, and they're going to be using that regardless if they're in person or whether they're virtual. So assignments and activities will be uploaded there, links to videos, blah, blah, blah. And in that regard, if we're all quarantining for a couple of weeks, there would be class time that the kids and the teachers would log on to a Google Meet or a Zoom meeting and kind of do the same thing that I'm doing right now, but I'm doing it with my class, right? And then that would go for 2 weeks, and then those folks would return and go back to the 5-day-a-week in-person instruction. And so you could have that happening in one classroom, or you could have that happening in several classrooms. I think that a building closure would become likely when we don't have staff, enough available staff to safely staff that building. And in that regard, that whole building would transition to the virtual environment, just like I described, for a 2-week period, and come back to 5-day-a-week in person when that quarantine period was over. It doesn't seem likely, although it's possible, that a district-wide closure would happen in the short term. And in the long term, it becomes more plausible as we get into cold and flu season, because if you have kind of a commingling of symptoms without a test, medical professionals in public health are going to say it might be COVID, so you need to quarantine. In that regard, you may be required to quarantine without even having a test because you have clustering of symptoms. Our school nurses and administrators and secretarial staff have that information. They have these symptoms that will be checked off of a list and then communicated to parents. And so think things like, okay, I've got a cough and a fever. Those are two fairly big things that might be COVID. So now you're going to go home and quarantine. if that person gets a test and it's negative, they still continue their quarantine for 10 days once the symptoms develop. The reason being is that a negative COVID test does not necessarily mean the absence of COVID. And so there's going to be this kind of rolling quarantine issue throughout the school year. And then again, when you get into the winter cold and flu season, in a lot of cases, it might be very tough to differentiate or identify whether or not this student has the flu or a cold or some kind of respiratory ailment that's not COVID. And that's why I say when we get into December, November, December, if there's a threshold of people that are sick, staff primarily is our primary concern. Not that we're not concerned about kids being sick, but if we can't staff buildings, then buildings would be closed and we would move to that virtual model. That will then be communicated at the time that it becomes necessary. And as I indicated, it's all as a result of the DHS approach to how we can hopefully prevent or stem the spread of COVID as much as possible. If we were not constrained by those requirements, then I think we'd figure out different ways to get the job done. But if we have to quarantine staff, there's not much we can do aside from moving them off site and having them, and students conduct education in a virtual capacity. So the only time that a negative COVID test really has a massive impact on your return to school is once you've done that quarantine period anyhow. And I know that's tough to comprehend and to understand. In the testing capacity and threshold, we're going to run into probably some issues with testing availability and results. We're talking about ramping up testing opportunities here in the community so that folks can get tested with a quicker frequency and then get the results back within a few days rather than sometimes waiting 6 or 8 days, which then your quarantine's for the most part done. But the nice thing about that would be if I just have, a runny nose and maybe a scratchy throat, maybe that is allergies and I don't have to worry about it so much. And then if I get a negative test and it's consistent with my allergies or my sickness, then I can come back within 24 hours after those symptoms subside and no medications, used. So there are options where you can have a negative COVID test and return, but it has to do, excuse me, the clustering of symptoms that you have and then their relative likelihood of being COVID. And so all of this is communicated by the public health department and worked kind of in conjunction with the school district and notification of parents on how we proceed.
Craig?
Yes.
Okay, so I know I've had some friends that were tested for it, and I think I understood everything you said, and hopefully everybody else did too. So they had a quarantine until they got their negative back, but then they could go back to work, but they had no symptoms at all anyhow. So you're saying if they don't, then they can go back to school if they have no symptoms? Okay.
Yeah, that's accurate. So it has to do with like that. It's so individual, which is part of why describing this to folks and why the last communication was like a 10-page Q&A with scenarios and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why communication is going to be so hugely important, right? So if you're a close contact and you have to quarantine, so there's close contacts that are of a suspected case, and there's close contacts of a positive case. Those are two different nuances. But if you're a close contact and you never develop symptoms and you have a negative test, yes, you can return within that 24-hour period as long as there's no, additional symptoms. But if you are, if you're a close contact with a known positive, then I don't believe they'll allow you to return even with a negative test. Then you have to maintain that quarantine period, right?
So my girlfriend, actually, her daughter had it. They got tested and they got to go back to work when they got their negative. Right. And that was county health. So I think it will, like you said, it'll go by each person, but they got to go back to work right away. So, and she worked for the county. So, but that's where it'll be interesting to see how they do it.
It also depends on the category of employee that you are.
Okay, gotcha. Like I have permanent allergies all year long. So I always have the symptoms that are listed. So now I get asked, do I have any new symptoms? So
yeah, that's accurate, right? Okay. Yep, and we're going to do the same thing with kids and staff members as well. So it won't be just blanket send everybody home. But on the same hand, if you have, because I'm a year-long allergy sufferer myself, so if I have a runny nose and a little bit of a cough and I know that it's associated with my runny nose, but I have no new symptoms, I'm not going to have to quarantine. I'm not going to have any problems, right? And we're going
Yep.
to have those conversations with kids and staff members too.
Okay.
But then the follow-up question always is, okay, if you develop anything else, like loss of taste or smell is a big deal.
Right.
So if that happens, then, oh, geez, and now is it a loss of taste because your nose is so plugged up, or is it a new loss of taste or smell?
Right.
And coughing with a fever and loss of taste or smell. So there's a ton of nuance there for sure. The other piece is that we only know what we know. So for those wondering, is it possible that, well, kids can be asymptomatic carriers, adults can be asymptomatic carriers, and is it possible that kids and staff will come to school that have COVID-19? Yes. Yes, that's absolutely possible. It's the same as, you going out in the community and having it and not knowing it. Those things are possible. But the whole idea is doing the best we can to identify if there are symptoms and then acting accordingly based on what those symptoms happen to be, which it can be different almost for every single, I wouldn't say every, but multiple scenarios under a broad umbrella.
Thank you. Do you have more that you're going to cover, or do you want to open up for more questions?
Well, I'll just quickly mention too that transportation-wise, folks have been wondering about transportation. So we're trying to minimize the number of kids on buses, appealing to parents to transport kids where possible. But knowing that we are going to have kids on buses, so very clearly kids will be wearing masks when they're on buses. They'll be provided an assigned seat. And once again, think about exactly what I mentioned about the classroom environment, which is the goal is to identify fewer close contacts if we have a positive COVID case. And so, if a kid is on a certain assigned seat, we're going to do our best to do one kid per seat and family members together. Some buses that may not be possible. But if a kid has an assigned seat, I know that they're sitting next to, kid A, B, and C versus potentially every kid on the bus.
Makes
so
sense.
then those contacts become those kids that are seated immediately near them versus everybody. And then, of course, they're going to, on nice days, they'll have the windows open and do things along those lines. So I think that, and I should mention that after the first week or so of school, we'll identify best we can bus routes that might need to be changed or have routes added. Because if we have any buses that are super crowded, we're going to have to make modifications there. Some of this we don't know until the rubber hits the road and kids are riding buses.
Makes sense. Angel, there's another question.
Yep, okay, so we have what types of additional cleaning processes are planned for the PAC?
Yeah, so in all of our buildings, what we've done is hired additional cleaners. There are going to be school personnel that do nothing but sanitize touch points all day long. Doorknobs and other areas, common areas. Kids, for example, when they're leaving their classroom for after that period or for the day, they're going to clean their little spot with some sanitizer. This is not bleach. It's very environmentally and person friendly sanitizer. And we're going to sanitize things that have multiple users. So think an iPad, that one kid might use and then another kid will use. So those will be sanitized. Bathrooms are going to be cleaned on a much more aggressive schedule. So, think every hour or thereabouts versus twice a day, perhaps. So those aspects of cleaning would be used throughout the district. The PAC would be dependent upon who's using it for what purpose and when. And that's probably the biggest rub because if it's a large event, we would recommend against having that. But if you can safely, well, I'll give you an example. We did the River Cities high school graduation in the PAC where attendance was limited. We had certain areas marked out where people could sit. There was, I think, 24 graduates and then their immediate family members. And frankly, it worked very well. And then when that was done, we went in and cleaned all the touch points in there, sanitized the seats and so forth, the restroom facilities, of course. So really it's about just a more aggressive cleaning schedule and doing some of those things that you probably wouldn't in the past.
Craig, sports. Can you cover sports too, how you guys are handling all that?
Yeah, absolutely. So as it stands right now, we pushed the start of fall sports back. September tomorrow is going to be is the start for golf, tennis, swim, and cross country. And then September 7th is the start for volleyball, football, and soccer. And the whole approach, everything that I've described prior, is going to be implemented to the best of our ability for things like athletics. Now, with that said, football, when you have 11 guys on one side and another 11 on the other, and they're breathing at each other and they're knocking into each other, you talk about a positive COVID case on the football team, it's quite likely that team will have to quarantine, right?
Yep.
And that is kind of the approach that we've utilized with regard to some of these more contact-based sports. The start was pushed back as a result of ensuring that we were able to start school in some capacity and not have kind of sports or an outbreak potentially caused by sports dictate our ability to start school. So that's really why it was pushed back. Keep in mind that under normal circumstances, equipment handout for football would have been early August, and we would have had by now, in fact, Friday night would be our second and sometimes our third game that we would have played. And so really it's just that pushback to hopefully get school up and running first, get our feet under us, and ensure that athletics aren't dictating what happens in the school environment to, at least in the initial degree. Things like cross country, golf, well, all the sports, in fact, we're isolating our contests to within the conference instead of doing like big multi-team invitationals. So things like volleyball, golf, tennis, you might have 4 schools, cross country, 4 schools, 5 schools, 16 schools come to do big invitationals. Those things aren't going to happen. So there'll be limited attendance. It'll be probably duels where it's one school versus another. And, with this, as much spacing and physical distancing in place as possible. As it stands right now, we're talking about limiting attendance at events to a degree. If we're outside, I think we have less of that issue. We'd still limit attendance and do our best to implement physical distancing measures. We're also going to live stream every home event that we host so that parents and grandparents and community members can log on and watch it real time via the internet. When we get into things like volleyball, we haven't completely figured it out quite yet what that's going to look like. There will be, it sounds as though there will be spectators allowed, but it'll likely be limited, 2 people per athlete. And then of course, there'll be specific areas in the gym where folks would be able to sit. Masks, of course, indoors would be required and so forth. So on the front end, we're looking at implementing both reduced attendance as well as some physical distancing measures and mask requirements to hopefully keep it going for as long as we can.
Perfect. Face shields, have them been considered after the mandate's done? Also, will you be keeping the mask? I guess is what I've been seeing once the mandate's done September 28th. I know face shields, I thought would be better for the kids, and I actually have worn them before because of my allergies and sinus infection. So just curious what your thoughts are on them for later on.
Yeah, public health and our medical advisors are indicating that face shields are not an appropriate barrier, that it's best to have some kind of a cloth barrier like a face mask. We do allow for a medical opt-out. The medical opt-out has to be signed by a medical professional. And advice from our legal counsel, that is the only opt-out we're offering.
Okay.
And the medical community has indicated that they are being somewhat stringent with regard to writing those opt-outs, because one of the things that's been shared, and I'm happy to pass it along to you, is a ton of research and data around the efficacy of wearing face coverings. And in fact, I just read an article today about the idea that it seems as though data suggests that folks that wear masks become less infected. And there's data that indicates you can have varying degrees of intensity of COVID infection, and that your exposure is greatly reduced when wearing a mask and when others are wearing a mask as well, because you're exposed to less virus at any one given time. That kind of deal. And therefore, those that wear masks, and when mask wearing is ubiquitous, you can still get infected, but it's less of a problem, less significant of an infection, which is kind of an interesting data piece. So the recommendation is for face masks, not shields. You can wear, we do have some clear face masks for people like think speech therapists or some of our language teachers, English language teachers or foreign language teachers, you know, where you need to see the lips and mouth move and that sort of thing. So we have some masks that would work in that capacity. As far as the mandate's concerned, the board took action to implement the mask requirement as, you know, aligned with the order for as long as we need to. So even when the order expires on September 28th, kids and staff and visitors to our buildings would be obligated to basically follow the same procedures for up to the entire school year. My hope is that it doesn't last the entire school year, but if it does, that's how long we'll do it.
Okay. Any other questions out there?
Hey, Craig, this is Angel. I'm going to ask on behalf of the chamber and of course the business community, but what can we as business owners, business leaders, and community members, what can we do to help you during this time? We know it's, you know, a pivot change for your organization and the students and the parents. So what can we do to help you at this point?
Yeah, and that's an excellent question, Angel. And in each of my communications to our parents, you know, I've mentioned this is our responsibility, right? And so, like I said, I think the measures that we implement now in the elementary school, keeping kindergartners apart, you know, those things are going to happen. We understand that. But for example, one of the main reasons we're thinking about even trying to get some kind of in-person instruction happening here is, number one, the need of the kids and this ability to, you know, have access to resources and socialize and all these things that are much more than just learning new things, you know, as a result of coming to school. But also in a community sense, people need to go to work. Parents have jobs to do. And, you know, not everybody can stay home with their kids. And I don't mean to pretend as though all we are is a glorified babysitter. Because I know for a fact we're much more than that, and I think this spring highlighted that to a huge degree. But on the same hand, there is community sentiment and need that parents need to be able to do things, and you can't really do things when you got kids at home all day long, 5 days a week. And if we're going to ensure that that's the case, we have to modify our behavior. And if we're behaving as though this thing doesn't exist and we're not really changing our behavior, we're going to have to quarantine, and it's going to cause problems. And frankly, if we shut down a school or even a grade level, I know that that's a hardship for parents. I know that full well. It's a hardship for me. All three of my kids go to high school. They'd be fine all day alone. But why is it a hardship? Because they don't need to be all day alone. They need to be in school doing things. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
And for an elementary parent, when my three kids were little, my wife and I talked about that. I don't know what we would do and continue to work while our kids are home. And with all of that, it is about behavior modification. And I sent an email to our staff last week on Thursday prior to, you know, it was our last in-service day, and sent some details about quarantining and contacts and all this stuff, but said, look, folks, if it hasn't dawned on you yet, it's all of our responsibilities to ensure that we're not becoming close contacts of people and don't have to quarantine. Because as I mentioned, I think much of what we're going to see, particularly in our secondary buildings, is going to be because of what's happening outside of school, not what's happening in school, right? Because we have some control, and it's easier to keep kids apart when they're older because they get it. And if everybody's wearing face coverings and everybody's doing what they need to do, washing their hands frequently, we're sanitizing touch points, we're using physical distancing, then it's pretty tough to identify close contacts. But you hear of, it was a great golf outing and we had a great time and we all hung out at the bar, which everybody likes to do, myself included. But then lo and behold, there was a positive COVID case and 2/3 of the people that were there are close contacts because they sat, you know, shoulder to shoulder with this person for 2-3 hours, and now you got to quarantine. There's some districts too that have had that circumstance where they pushed the start of their school year off because, well, too many of our staff members need to quarantine. Well, that's because too many of your staff members aren't taking it seriously and are not taking these measures aren't taking these measures to heart. And to that, I guess I would argue we can debate all day long whether COVID-19 is a big thing, is a little thing. You know, is it killing people? Is it not killing people? We can argue all about this all day long, but one thing that we can argue about is what we're beholden to. And the idea too, I think for community members to understand is, if the medical community and public health is telling our organization, these are things you should do, it's pretty tough for us just to go, nah, we're not interested. We're not going to do that, right? So we got to play the game a little bit. And with the way their contact tracing and quarantine protocols are, you really don't have a lot of latitude. The only latitude you would have is to pretend as though it doesn't exist and go about your business, and then run the risk of infecting other individuals, and God forbid having some of those be complications. Or, you know, identifying, yeah, I shouldn't be going to work or school today. So that's another thing the community can do, aside from education and reminders and all, playing the game, as it were, because I'm guilty of this myself, and that is stay home when you're sick. You know, because it might be COVID-19. And if you have a couple of symptoms and you stay home, and in 24 hours or 48 hours you get better, you go back to work, great. And I'm not telling you to lie about whether or not you have COVID, but what I'm saying is, if it's a couple of low-level symptoms and you stay home and you get better, you're absolutely able to go to work or school, right? But if you have difficulty breathing, loss of taste or smell, a fever, you need to get COVID tested, you probably need to stay home even longer. So just a few things that are inconveniences for sure, things that I'm personally sick and tired of, a lot of people are. But if we all played the game, I think that we'd be able to maintain this for longer than if we didn't.
Sounds good. Any other comments, questions for Craig? Angel, anything else that came through?
I'm not seeing anything right now. I'll just give it another minute or so if someone's typing a question, because it doesn't show me if someone's typing, so.
Okay. Craig, if there's any questions, comments, or concerns, is there a way that they can reach you?
Absolutely. So if you just Google my name or WRPS, you go to our website, my contact information's there. It's first dot last name at WRPS.net. My phone number is 715-424-6701. I answer all my phone calls if I'm here. I return voicemails, and I also respond to emails. Absolutely anytime, doesn't matter who you are or whether or not you're angry or you just want to holler at me. I'll do the gambit.
I'm not hollering today. No, I'm just kidding. So, well, we thank you for your time. I appreciate it. And we look forward to getting you guys getting kicked off the school year, and hopefully everything goes well. If anything else pops up, we will forward it on to you. So
absolutely, that's great.
We appreciate your time, and thank you all for attending, and we hope that you have a great school year.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks, Craig.